After 3 years of building our new 35-foot steel boat from a bare hull, we're ready to set off on a new cruise. Buying and storing provisions for an extended cruise is a fairly daunting task. I attend to some last-minute jobs, here installing a radar reflector on the backstays. We're all set to go. We sail out to Block Island, and immediately we have to contend with a 3-day gale in the harbor. A lot of the time it's too rough to go ashore, so we have to amuse ourselves the best we can on board. But we finally get going in fairly brisk winds, and here you see our Yankee set on the pole. In the Chesapeake, we stop in Baltimore and anchor right beneath the World Trade Center building in the heart of downtown. A more secluded anchorage in the Chesapeake, this one on the Wye River near St. Michael's. Sailing on the eastern shore, I couldn't understand why we're going so slow, but when we got anchored, I discovered this crab pot hooked on our rudder. It's only October, but it turns cold. Some days it doesn't even get out of the 30s. Leaving the anchorage at Crisfield, a nice little eastern shore town, and starting down the waterway at Norfolk in the early morning along with a bunch of other boats waiting for the first bridge to open. It's still cold in the Alligator-Pungo Canal, but at least we have clear weather and beautiful sunsets. We're headed for the Western Caribbean, and we leave Beaufort, North Carolina, and sail directly to the Turks and Caicos. From there, we go through the Windward Passage between Cuba and Haiti. We stop at the Cayman Islands and on to the Bay Islands of Honduras. We spend the winter in Honduras, Guatemala, and Belize, and then we head through the Yucatan Channel to Key West and Miami. We had some fairly rough weather the first few days out of Beaufort, and the seas built up pretty good, although they never became particularly threatening. The wind was on the beam, mostly around 30 knots. Even though it was uncomfortable a lot of the time, we were glad to be making good progress with days' runs of 150 miles or better. But as we get further south, the wind eased off and eventually got very light. After some time in the Turks and Caicos, we move on to the Cayman Islands. They're off the usual cruising routes, so we're virtually the only cruising boat there. Here we're anchored off the Holiday Inn. The big attraction here, of course, is the scuba diving. The reefs are quite beautiful and there's plenty of life. Here a queen angelfish. We sail on a couple hundred miles to the Bay Islands of Honduras and make our landfall on the island of Guanaja. And here's a waterfront view of the town of Coxon Hole on Roatan. Definitely third world. Our son Jeff flies in to visit us and spends about a month with us during his college vacation. Liz and Jeff on the main street of Coxon Hole. Pretty basic little community. Roatan has some beautiful countryside. The island's about 30 miles long and only 2 or 3 miles wide. We walk over to the northern side of the island. Beautiful beaches there. Quite lovely scenery. Kids always like to have their pictures taken. Many of the people on Roatan are descended from English buccaneers, and English is still widely spoken. Horizon in one of the snug anchorages on the south shore, this one at Old French Harbor. Jeff scuba diving in Roatan. We did a bunch of good dives there. Jeff on the beach at one of the Pelican Keys near Roatan. From the anchorage on the island of Barbaretta, we watch a funnel cloud dip down from the squall. We sail about 20 miles toward the mainland of Honduras to a group of islands called Cayos Cochinos, or Hog Islands. We anchored in this bay where an American couple was basically homesteading. They'd built a house and several other buildings. It's a beautiful but somewhat isolated spot. They showed us around and let us take showers at their outdoor shower facility. Horizon at anchor here from their house. We spent several days in this area here, relaxing under our awning. Lots of little islets to explore. We sail back to Roatan so Jeff can catch his plane home, a DC-3, the only plane they were flying into Roatan at that time. And we leave for an overnight sail to Guatemala. We anchor off the town of Livingston at the mouth of the Rio Dulce. And the next day, after we check in with the officials, we start up the river. The opening is barely visible. The first part winds through steep jungle-covered cliffs. There are Mayan Indian settlements along the riverbanks. And we see whole families of Mayans in their cayucos or canoes. During a trip inland from the Rio Dulce, we check out a big banana plantation. We leave Guatemala and sail up along the coast of Belize inside the barrier reef. We stop at Belize City. Here are some fishing boats moored in the river that runs through the center of town. Belize City had the reputation of being a pretty rough spot, but we didn't have any trouble there. This sign gave us a chuckle. And Jeff joins us again for his spring vacation. Inside the barrier reef, the longest in the Western Hemisphere, we watch the Belize fishermen. Liz on the reef here with Horizon anchored in the background. These shacks here were Ricardo's Beach Resort. They even had a printed brochure. There are lots of little islets inside the reef, although a lot of them aren't big enough to offer any protection. These are the Queen Keys. This is Laughing Bird Key, a slightly bigger island. There's some Belize fishermen camped on it. We got blown out of this anchorage in the middle of the night. But a lot of the so-called islands are just mangrove lagoons. They offered good shelter, but there was nothing to do there. We got pretty sick of looking at mangroves. On Southwater Key, a real island that actually had a little resort on it. We took a trip inland to visit the Mayan ruins at Altan Ha. They date from about 700 AD. In the early spring, we start beating our way toward Key West against an easterly wind, and with a west-going current, the seas get really nasty. It's only 350 miles to Key West, but it takes us 5 days. It's one of the most uncomfortable trips we've ever had, and we finally have to heave to for a few hours just to get some rest. The seas weren't particularly big, but they were chaotic and confused, and smashing into them was no fun. We're on our way across the Atlantic now, starting with a 1,000-mile leg from Miami to Bermuda, then 1,800 miles from Bermuda to the Azores, and another 1,000 miles from the Azores to Spain. We have several days of strong headwinds leaving Miami, and it begins to look like a repeat of the Yucatan Channel passage. But just as we start to get really discouraged and even talk about turning back, the wind shifts into the southwest directly behind us, and we have delightful sailing for the next few days. We're eating up the miles now, and spirits on board improve considerably. And we soon make our landfall on Bermuda. Bermuda is a very beautiful island, but it's also very expensive. We rented a motorbike to get around. It's probably a lot more dangerous than sailing to get there, because they drive on the left and the traffic's pretty heavy. Some of the beautiful pink sand beaches and the turquoise water. A steel band on the pier. After a couple weeks in Bermuda, we motor out Town Cut and start off on our next leg, the 1,800 miles to the Azores. We luck out on this passage with mostly settled weather and moderate beam winds. Just good sailing. On we go, day after day. Seas are pretty big, but the swells are long enough so that it's not real uncomfortable. Mostly we're able to spend the night watches inside and only look out every 10 or 15 minutes. Waking Liz for her watch, we stand 4 hours on and 4 hours off. The captain at the chart table. Still no electronic aids to navigation, so we're dependent on celestial. It just doesn't get much better than this at sea. But as we get near the Azores, we sail into the big Azores high and run out of wind, and we have to motor most of the last day. But in the morning we have the nearly 8,000-foot mountain on Pico in sight, and we motor past the patchwork fields on Fayal and enter the port of Orta, 14 days out of Bermuda. Orta's a major stop for transatlantic yachts, and they built a big 160-slip marina to accommodate them. View of Orta with the marina behind the breakwater in the center of the picture. The Azores, of course, are Portuguese, and the town has a real European feel to it. And Pico, just a few miles away, is visible from just about anywhere. It's early June, and the roadways are lined with flowers. Liz sitting on the wall that surrounds the marina with Pico in the background. It's become a tradition for visiting yachts to paint the yacht's name on the wall, and some of them get quite elaborate. I'm no artist, but I go to work on ours. The finished product, not too bad. After looking at Pico for a week or so, I start thinking about climbing it. I get together with some English guys and we take the ferry over. This guy's giving us directions. It's not a hard climb, but it's very windy up there, and we have to creep along the wall of a volcanic crater. The actual peak rises out of the crater. It's cloudy down below, but the clouds part enough to give us some views. Leaving Orta, heading for Spain, we're actually sailing amongst the Azores for a couple of days. Up here in the cockpit with one of the islands in the background. Being close to the islands means we have to keep a good watch, and it also means that there's a lot of sail changing to do in the fluky winds. Even when we get clear of the islands, the weather isn't as settled as it was on the passage from Bermuda. But we do have some nice days. But eventually the wind gets light and we drop the mainsail and sail with 2 jibs, pointing out our landfall on the Spanish coast. Our first port in Spain is Cadiz, and we tie up in the fishing harbor, 3,800 miles from Miami, 32 days at sea. Cadiz is a wonderful introduction to Europe with its narrow, carless streets. It's a delight just to wander through the town. We take the train up to Sevilla for a couple of days. Here, a view of the town from the cathedral or the bull ring in the background. Here I'm in the Alcazar, or Moorish Palace. We move on to Gibraltar, where Jeff is flying in for the summer. Making our approach to the rock, and here a view of the rock from the airport. We walk up on the rock, and that big concrete slab there is for water catching. Liz and Jeff on the ridge, and we encounter the Barbary apes. Of course, the legend has it that as long as the apes are there, Gibraltar will be British. You can see the little one there clinging to his mother. A view of the 2 marinas in Gibraltar. You can see they're real close to the airport runway, which is built out over the water. There's not a lot of flat land in Gibraltar. This first summer in Spain, we work our way along the Spanish coast and out to the Balearic Islands then back to the Spanish mainland to Barcelona, and then just south of Barcelona where we winter. We put the boat in a marina and rent a car for a few days. We drive up to Granada and explore the Alhambra. The Alhambra is another Moorish palace, and the Alcazaba, seen here, is the fortress part of it. A view of Granada through typical Moorish arches here. We drive through the foothills of the Sierra Nevadas, where little white villages cling to the mountainsides. And we climb the highest mountain in Spain, Mulhacén, over 11,000 feet high. Jeff and I on a snowfield. And from the summit, view of the Sierra Nevadas. Not a very hospitable landscape. Walking through one of the mountain villages, there's nobody around at midday. We round the southeast corner of Spain at Cabo de Gata, the Cape of the Cat. A view of the Spanish coast at Alicante, some of the worst of resort Spain. But the actual town of Alicante is quite pleasant. We sail out to the Balearic Islands, a group of islands about 60-70 miles off the coast. A view of the harbor at San Telmo on Ibiza, with the horizon in the center of the picture there. Pretty typical Mediterranean harbor scene. Sailing past a rock formation on the corner of Ibiza. And we sail out to Majorca and find some pretty spectacular anchorages on the northwest coast of Majorca. We walk up to the village of Dea. We learn that the villages on Majorca are ordinarily built inland because of coastal raids by pirates in medieval times. Liz takes a peek into a private garden. In one of the larger towns, Sóller, there's a little trolley that takes you from the port area back into the town. Olive trees on the Majorcan hillsides. We walk up into the mountains on the Pilgrim's Way, a stone pathway built back in the 1300s for religious pilgrims. A spectacular view of Sóller and the port area. And walking in the hills, look at that landscape. The Med is crowded, but you can always find an anchorage by yourself if you want. And there's no complaints about the scenery here. Typical Mediterranean landscape. On Majorca, watchtowers were built every few miles along the coast to watch for pirates in medieval times. We walk up to the ruins of an old castle built right out of the rock. The doorway here commands a view of miles of coastline. Out on Menorca now, wherever you go on these islands, there's old walls and ruins. A downpour on Menorca that turns the city's streets into rivers. You can't appreciate the significance of this picture until you realize that we'd been in the Med since mid-July. It's now mid-September, and until now we'd hardly even seen a cloud. Prehistoric ruins on Menorca. There are lots of these on the island. The T-shaped rock is called a taula, and it's set in a circle of stones like sort of a mini Stonehenge. Back on the mainland, we spend some time in Barcelona, and we happen to be on the city wall when they have a big ceremony bringing the Olympic flag from Seoul to Barcelona for the '92 Olympics. Barcelona's a great city, and the Ramblas, shown here, is a world-famous street. It runs for about a mile back from the port, and there's always something going on. There are bird sellers, flower sellers, and street performers. Just walking on the Ramblas was entertainment in itself. The Gothic quarter near the cathedral was interesting, too. You could buy just about anything in the huge market, from hundreds of kinds of fish to hundreds of varieties of olives. In front of the cathedral, we'd watch people performing the sardana, the national dance of Catalonia. Gaudi was a famous architect of the first part of the 20th century, and his Sagrada Familia, his big cathedral, is one of the landmarks of Barcelona. It was never finished, but they're still working on it slowly. The interior is really just a big construction site. But you can go in it and climb partway up the towers. We spent the winter just a few miles down the coast from Barcelona, and here's some of the other cruisers also wintering here. We're standing on the bow of a little 20-foot Swedish boat to try to lift the stern out of the water so the guy can get at his propeller. We had a great time in this little marina. There are about 20 boats wintering there and a bunch of different nationalities. And we had a bunch of social events. Here, our Christmas dinner. We put on a Christmas pantomime. Here were the two ugly stepsisters in the Cinderella story. We were in a great little town with all kinds of things going on. Here, dancing the sardana again on one of the main streets. These human towers here are sort of a tradition in Catalonia. Liz with some of our cruising friends out watching the carnival celebration. Just about everybody in town turns out, and a lot of them spend months working on their costumes. This girl's dressed up as a tourist. They see plenty of those in Spain. A lottery seller here. This was one of the best costumes, we thought, a whole bunch of people parading down the street as headless shirts. They had holes cut in the ties so they could see where they were going. This carnival parade was really only one of the activities that lasted through a whole week. One of the costume townspeople talking to the cruisers here. Later in the winter, they have another celebration where all the animals from the nearby countryside are paraded through the city streets and blessed by the priest. Pretty elaborate affair. Jeff comes to visit us, and we rent a car to do some tourist stuff. Here, looking at Roman ruins at a city a few miles away. Quite a few towns in Spain have pretty well preserved medieval bridges and buildings. In mid-March, we set out across the Med, stopping at harbors in the Balearics, Sardinia, Sicily, Malta, before moving on to Greece and Turkey. Leaving the Balearics here, we made most of that trip across the Med in winds over 30 knots. At times, we got down to the trysail in strong winds. Here we're tied up in the little fishing port of Favignana on the coast of Sicily. It's a tiny harbor with barely enough room to let out enough scope on the anchor. Some people claim that this is the island where Odysseus encountered the Cyclops in the Homeric legend. But today it's just a quiet little fishing port. They go after tuna fish here. They use these anchors to set big nets by hand, and they snare the tuna in their annual migration. We had some trouble in this harbor when we had strong winds, over 60 knots. They were blowing from the direction of this mountain, and they'd blow first around one side of it and then around the other side of it, so that it hit us on different sides in the harbor. Eventually our anchor dragged, and we had to side tie to the wall. It was still blowing the next day, so we decided to get out of there. Wasn't much better at sea, and we went down to the trysail again. The seas were really steep and confused, and we took heavier water on the boat than we'd ever taken before. We had to enter the harbor at Malta under sail because the water pump on our engine chose that time to quit. A view of Valletta here, the capital city of Malta. these old British buses that they drive here. The Maltese people were very friendly and helpful, but the bus drivers had the unfortunate habit of overcharging us with the confusing Maltese money. We take the bus up to the old medieval city of Medina. Narrow, picturesque streets, and there's prehistoric ruins as well. Off to Greece now with more strong winds. After a wild night of thunderstorms, we enter the harbor at Zante in the Ionian. The harbor at Zante is pretty typical of Med harbors. It's protected by a couple of breakwaters, and the yachts tie stern to the breakwater. We go on to Ithaca, which was Odysseus's home. It's still early in the season, so we're the only yacht there. It's a picturesque anchorage. We rent a motor scooter and travel the narrow winding roads to the other end of the island. Supposedly the site of Odysseus's palace here. Around the corner of mainland Greece and into the Gulf of Corinth, we tie to the wall of the nice little town of Gallic City. Horizon and the other boats on the wall with snow-capped Mount Parnassus in the background. From Gallic City, we take the bus up to Delphi to visit the Oracle. Below us, all that green there is olive trees. Delphi has a spectacular hillside site overlooking a deep gorge in the mountains. The theater at Delphi, what a place to watch a play. The Sanctuary of Athena. These columns appear in all the tourist brochures. Plenty of school groups here at this time of year. We take our time and read the guidebook as we go along. Liz in front of a wall which has carved inscriptions on it from 3,000 years ago. Heading for Athens, we pass through the Corinth Canal between mainland Greece and the Peloponnesus. The canal is very narrow, only a little more than 60 feet wide, so it's one-way traffic only. Incredibly, right after we went through and we were tied up and paying our fee at the other end of the canal, a cruise ship got stuck in the eastern entrance, and it was a number of hours before the canal was open to traffic again. Judging from all the paint marks on the rocks that line the canal, we figure this must happen fairly often. Jeff flies into Athens to meet us, and we do the tourist sites. Looking out over the city from the Acropolis, and a view of the Parthenon. They're actually doing some renovation on the Parthenon, so this side of it is not quite as attractive. We sail down to the Peloponnesus to see some of the historic sites we've read about. These are the walls of the ancient city of Tiryns, built about 3,500 years ago. It takes a little imagination and the guidebook to visualize what the city must have looked like. There's not much left of it. In this vaulted chamber, the rocks have been rubbed smooth and shiny by the domestic animals passing through there over the centuries. We visit the more famous Bronze Age site of Mycenae, with its famous Lion Gate entrance. The approach to the Lion Gate. Mycenae has a real commanding view of the surrounding landscape, and in the distance you can make out the bay where we've left the boat. We sail on to the island of Hydra, where the main port is just a tiny little indentation in the coast. Colorful fishing boats in the harbor, and a fisherman mending his nets. A view of Hydra from above, and you can see the fast hydrofoil coming in from the mainland. We sail out into the central Aegean to the island of Mykonos, where these windmills are a Mykonos landmark. The narrow whitewashed streets have no real pattern to them. They were originally built that way to confuse pirates. But it's an attractive town to wander around in. The nearby island of Delos is supposed to be the birthplace of Apollo. Today, it's a big archaeological site. This 2,000-year-old house is remarkably well preserved. Dolphin mosaics on the floor of one house, again, over 2,000 years old. Another colorful fishing harbor on the island of Paros. And again, the narrow whitewashed streets. A hillside view on Paros. Paros is one of the bigger islands, and there's more greenery here too. You see these blue-domed Greek Orthodox churches just about everywhere. We leave the central Aegean and sail over to the Dodecanese off the Turkish coast. Here, the island of Samos. Everywhere you look on these islands, there's archaeological junk. This is just stuff sitting by the roadside. One feature of sailing in the Aegean is the north wind known as the Meltemi. It blows pretty constantly in July and August, often up to gale force. Here we found shelter from the Meltemi in a nice, secure little harbor. Unfortunately, there's not much to do there, and we end up sitting there for 4 days. It's not a very big anchorage, and we have to take a line to shore to keep ourselves from swinging into the rocks. The weather settles down a little, and we're glad to move on to a slightly more civilized spot. This is the island of Patmos. Liz setting the pole here as we move on down the chain of the Dodecanese. The anchorage at Kalymnos, it was gusting 40 to 50 knots most of the time we were there. The wind accelerates over these bare, treeless hills. Another view of the same anchorage. It looks nice, but the wind really wore us down. To get off the boat, we do some walking in the hills. These islands had all been stripped of trees in ancient times. The lack of greenery started to get to us. We sail over to the Turkish coast. It's a little more green, and there are some nice anchorages. We walked through a little Turkish village. We'd originally planned to spend another year in the Med, but we changed our minds and decided to go back across the Med. We sailed down to Crete and then through the Straits of Messina between Italy and Sicily, and then on to Gibraltar. We tack our way along the north coast of Crete, and we visit the Minoan Palace at Knossos. This site was partially restored after it had been excavated, so it's a little easier to imagine what it might have been like. Liz in the throne room of the palace, and looking at one of the big jugs they used for storage. We continue tacking our way along the north coast of Crete. It's a little bit rough, but it's only day sailing. We tie up in the commercial harbor at Suda Bay. We're the only boat there, but it's a good spot, so we stay for almost a week. From there, we take a bus up into the mountains to do the 12-mile hike through the Samaria Gorge. It's a long way, but it's all downhill, and the gorge itself is pretty spectacular. The sheer rock walls are nearly 1,000 feet high, and in places, the space between them is only about 10 feet. At the end of the hike, there's a boat to take you back to a place where you catch the bus to get back to town. Sailing back across the Med, we encounter lots of unsettled weather and thunderstorms and squalls. From Gibraltar, we sail 700 miles to the Canary Islands and then more than 2,800 miles direct to Bequia in the Caribbean. Leaving Gibraltar with the Spanish coast to starboard. Calm weather at first. We set 2 jibs plus the trysail to damp the rolling and just creep along. Here's our wake at about 2 knots. We finally do get some wind, and we're visited by a school of dolphins. Finally at anchor in Las Palmas and Gran Canaria. It looks very nice, but there's a slick of black oil on the water. Very dirty port. And leaving Las Palmas, we had light airs for the first 2 or 3 days. But after that, we picked up the wind and we held it all the way to the Caribbean. It's the best long passage we've ever had. We averaged close to 6 knots for 3 weeks. And on the whole passage, we only ran the engine in gear for 8 hours. Still, 3 weeks is a long time to be at sea. We sailed right past Barbados on day 20, but didn't stop. We'd been there before, and we wanted to get to Bequia, where we planned to spend some time. The harbor at Bequia, and a shot of the anchorage from the beach. After so many rocky, treeless harbors in the Med, it was nice to see some tropical green. It was also nice not to have to go on watch at night. And horizon leaving Bequia as we get ready to sail across the Caribbean and back up to New England.